The cry that pierced the afternoon stillness wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. It was the universal sound of a mother's soul tearing apart. Tom Mitchell's weathered hands froze on the steering wheel, his 68-year-old heart recognizing something in that desperate call that made his blood run cold. Tom. Emma Chen Williams touched his shoulder gently, her 7 months pregnant belly pressing against the dashboard. You look like you've seen a ghost. He had. That sound, God help him. He'd heard it before, 15 years ago, from a young giraffe his Margaret had saved. The same keening wail that had haunted his dreams since Margaret's death 2 years ago. Marcus Johnson lowered his camera, his war-trained instincts alert. That's not a normal distress call. Tom's voice came out rough, broken. No, it's not. His hand found Margaret's compass hanging from his neck. That's Grace, and she's calling for help. Some promises transcend death, and some debts take 15 years to repay. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The Blackthorn Wildlife Preserve stretched across 8,000 acres of Texas hill country, a landscape that could fool you into thinking you'd stepped into East Africa. Acacia trees dotted golden grasslands, their umbrella crowns casting shadows where zebras and giraffes grazed alongside native white-tailed deer. This had been Mitchell land for 4 generations before Tom and Margaret converted it into a sanctuary, their dream of bringing Africa to America, of healing both animals and hearts. Thomas Mitchell had spent 40 years as a ranger, but the last 2 had aged him more than all the previous decades combined. Margaret's death from pancreatic cancer had left him hollow, volunteering at the preserve not from dedication, but from the simple inability to sit in their empty house. Her compass, worn smooth by her fingers, hung from a chain around his neck, the same compass she'd carried the day she saved a days-old giraffe calf from barbed wire. The calf she'd named Grace. That was 15 years ago, when their autistic son Daniel was still alive, when saving things still felt possible. Emma Chen Williams adjusted her medical kit with practiced efficiency, her movements careful around her prominent belly. At 35, after 5 years of trying, this pregnancy felt like a miracle she didn't quite trust. The daughter of a Chinese immigrant mother and an African-American father who'd met during the civil rights movement, Emma had fought her way through veterinary school, through the prejudices of colleagues who saw her mixed heritage and gender before her brilliance. Her husband David was deployed in Kuwait, wouldn't be home for the birth. She touched her belly reflexively, feeling the baby shift, and tried not to think about doing this alone. Marcus Johnson sat in the back, camera cradled like the rifle he'd once carried through Fallujah. At 45, he'd traded combat photography for wildlife, finding in the patient stalking of animals a kind of meditation that kept the nightmares at bay. His Pulitzer sat in a storage unit along with the rest of his old life, including photos of his daughter Sophie, who'd stopped taking his calls 2 years ago. Through his lens, he could make sense of violence in nature that human violence had made incomprehensible. Every photo was a letter to Sophie he'd never send, an explanation of a world he'd learned to see differently. The preserve had become their refuge, these 3 broken people finding purpose in protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves. The patrol had started like any other Friday afternoon, the 3 of them checking the southern boundary where poachers sometimes tested the fences. Marcus had spotted the unusual track's first deep giraffe prints mixed with something that made Tom's chest tighten, the chaotic scratches of hyena paws. Too many to count, all converging toward the acacia grove near Miller's Creek. That's not normal, Emma said, studying the pattern through binoculars. Hyenas don't usually hunt giraffe calves in broad daylight, and these tracks... She paused, frowning. They're circling, not pursuing. Tom accelerated the Land Cruiser, Margaret's compass bouncing against his chest with each bump. The cries grew louder as they approached. No longer just one voice, but a horrible symphony, high-pitched distress calls layered with deeper, guttural sounds he'd never heard a giraffe make. Through the heat shimmer rising from the ground, the acacia grove appeared like a mirage, its ancient trees twisted into shapes that had taken centuries to form. Marcus raised his telephoto lens, his breathing controlled from years of training. Jesus Christ, he whispered, the camera dropping from his eye. There's a calf trapped in the trees. Its neck is caught between two branches. They crested the small rise, and the scene below hit them like a physical blow. A young giraffe, maybe 6 months old, was trapped in a natural vise created by two acacia trees that had grown together. The Y-shaped formation had become a prison. The calf's neck wedged deep in the fork about 8 feet off the ground. Its legs dangled and kicked uselessly, its body weight pulling down while the branches held firm. Dark stains on its neck showed where the bark had rubbed the skin raw. But it was the circle of hyenas that made Tom's blood run cold. 8 of them, arranged in an almost deliberate formation around the trapped calf. They weren't rushing in for the kill, weren't laughing in that terrifying way hyenas do when they're about to feed. Instead, they paced and whined, occasionally darting forward only to retreat again, as if confused by their own intentions. The matriarch was unmistakable, a massive female with a scarred face, her left eye milky white from some old injury. Tom had seen her before in Marcus's photographs, always at the edges, always alone. But here she stood at the head of her clan, and there was something in her posture that seemed almost hesitant. "Look at the branch," Emma said suddenly, pointing. "Those marks aren't from the calf struggling. Those are bite marks, fresh ones." Marcus zoomed in with his camera, documenting what seemed impossible. "They've been chewing at the wood. The hyenas have been trying to—" He trailed off, unable to voice the absurdity of what he was seeing. The calf's cries reached a new pitch of desperation, and that's when they heard the thunder, not from the cloudless sky, but from the earth itself, hoofbeats pounding with the force of maternal rage. Through the golden grass came a full-grown female giraffe, 16 feet of fury charging at impossible speed. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel as recognition hit him like a lightning strike. The faded green collar around her neck, the distinctive star-shaped patch on her shoulder, the way she held her head slightly tilted, a habit from an old injury. "Grace," he breathed, the name escaping like a prayer. Grace slammed into the hyena circle with the force of a freight train. Her front legs became weapons, each kick capable of shattering a lion's skull. She pivoted and struck with precision, sending hyenas tumbling through the dust. The matriarch with the scarred face yelped and rolled away from a blow that missed her by inches. The clan scattered, regrouped, circled again. But Grace was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of protective fury that defied the usual slow-motion grace of her species. But even as Tom watched Grace fight with desperate courage, he could see the horrible truth. She'd driven them back 10 feet, 20. But the hyenas weren't truly retreating. They were waiting. And Grace, for all her power, couldn't reach her calf. She couldn't lift it, couldn't break the branches, couldn't do anything but fight an endless battle against predators that would eventually exhaust her. The trapped calf's struggles were weakening. Grace seemed to realize it too, her movements becoming more frantic, less coordinated. She rushed to the trees, reached up with her long neck, trying to comfort her baby. But the angle was wrong. She couldn't maintain contact and watch for hyenas at the same time. Tom saw the moment despair entered her eyes, that distinctly human expression that Margaret had always insisted animals were capable of. "We have to do something," Emma said, already reaching for her medical kit. "That calf won't last another hour." Marcus lowered his camera, his face pale. "We can't interfere. It's nature's way. I've photographed 100 kills. We don't—" His words were cut short by something none of them could have predicted. Grace stopped fighting. She stood perfectly still for a moment, her sides heaving, then slowly, deliberately, turned away from her trapped calf and the circling hyenas. She looked directly at their vehicle, at Tom behind the wheel, and began walking toward them. "What's she doing?" Emma whispered. But Tom knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. Grace approached the Land Cruiser with measured steps, her eyes never leaving Tom's face through the windshield. When she was 10 feet away, she stopped. Then, in a gesture that would haunt Tom forever, she lowered her magnificent head in what could only be described as supplication. The proud creature who'd just been fighting for her calf's life was bowing to him, asking for something no wild animal should ever have to ask of a human. "My God," Marcus breathed, raising his camera instinctively. She's She's asking for help. The silence that followed Grace's bow stretched like a held breath. Tom's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, his movements slow and deliberate. 68 years of life, 40 years as a ranger, and nothing had prepared him for this moment, a wild giraffe asking for human intervention, breaking every law of nature he'd been taught to respect. "Tom, don't," Marcus warned, his voice tight with the tension of a man who'd seen too many situations spiral out of control. She's still a wild animal. Stressed, desperate, she could kill you with one kick. But Tom was already stepping out of the vehicle, removing his worn Stetson hat and holding it against his chest. The gesture felt right somehow, like approaching a grieving widow at a funeral. Grace remained motionless, only her dark eyes tracking his movement. Behind her, the hyenas maintained their vigil around the trapped calf, whose cries had weakened to exhausted whimpers. "Hello, Grace," Tom said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. Margaret saved you when you were just hours old. You were tangled in barbed wire near the eastern fence line. Your mother had been killed by poachers." Grace's ears swiveled toward his voice. Tom took another step forward, aware that Emma and Marcus had gotten out of the vehicle behind him, equally aware that one wrong move could trigger an instinctive defensive response that would crush his skull like an egg. "Margaret bottle-fed you for 3 months, he continued, inching closer. "You used to follow her around the rehabilitation center like a puppy. She'd sing to you old gospel hymns her grandmother taught her. Amazing Grace was your favorite. That's why she named you that." When he was within arm's reach, Tom slowly extended his weathered hand. Grace lowered her massive head further, allowing him to touch the side of her neck. His fingers found what they were looking for, a raised scar hidden beneath her coat, shaped like a crescent moon. The wire had cut deep before Margaret had freed her, leaving a mark that would last a lifetime. "Oh my God," Emma breathed from behind him. "She remembers. She actually remembers." Tom's eyes burned with unshed tears as he stroked Grace's neck. The giraffe's whole body was trembling, whether from exhaustion or emotion. He couldn't tell. "Margaret always said you were special. Said you had an old soul. She'd talk to you like you understood every word." His voice broke slightly. "Maybe you did." Grace pulled back suddenly, turning toward her trapped calf. She took 3 steps toward the acacia trees, then looked back at Tom, the message as clear as spoken words. "Help my baby." Marcus had his camera up, capturing every moment of this impossible interaction. Through his viewfinder, he watched Tom follow Grace toward the trapped calf, watched the hyenas part like a biblical sea, not retreating, but not advancing either. The scarred matriarch tilted her head, that milky eye seeming to see more than it should. "This is unprecedented," Marcus murmured, his finger never leaving the shutter button. "In all my years documenting wildlife, I've never seen anything like this. She's trusting us with her calf's life." Emma had grabbed her medical kit and was assessing the situation with clinical precision. The calf was wedged tight, its neck swollen from the pressure and struggling. Dark blood seeped from where the bark had worn through hide. "We need to cut these branches, but it's going to take time, and the calf is going into shock. Look at its eyes, pupils dilated, breathing shallow." "We can't do this," Marcus said suddenly, lowering his camera. His hands were shaking now, not from fear but from an internal war raging behind his eyes. "I've spent 20 years documenting nature without interfering. That's the code. We observe. We don't intervene. If we save this calf, we're playing God." "Playing God?" Emma rounded on him, her pregnancy hormones adding fire to her words. "We play God every day. We've built fences, introduced non-native species, changed migration patterns. This entire preserve is humans playing God." "That's different. Is it? I took an oath as a veterinarian to prevent suffering where I can. That calf is suffering. That mother is suffering. Tell me how walking away makes us noble instead of cowards." Tom stood between Grace and her calf, his hand still on the mother's neck, feeling her rapid heartbeat through her hide. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Grace, about why she matters." He reached into his shirt and pulled out Margaret's compass, its brass surface catching the late afternoon sun. 15 years ago, Margaret was dying. The cancer had spread everywhere, and she knew she had weeks at best. She was worried about all her animals, but especially Grace. Made me promise to look after her. Marcus's expression shifted, recognizing the weight of deathbed promises from his own experience in war. Tom continued. "The day before Margaret died, Grace showed up at our house. Don't ask me how she found it 5 miles from her usual territory. She stood outside Margaret's bedroom window for 6 hours. Margaret could barely lift her head, but she saw her. Grace had brought her first calf to show Margaret, as if she knew it was goodbye." The silence stretched again, broken only by the weakening cries of the trapped calf and the low rumbles from Grace's throat. "After Margaret died, I'd see Grace sometimes on the preserve, always at a distance. But she'd stop and look at me, really look, like she was checking on me. Animals don't do that, scientists would say. But Grace did. She remembered Margaret's kindness and somehow extended it to me." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her other hand protectively cradling her belly. "Tom, we're wasting time. That calf needs help now." Marcus stood frozen, his camera hanging from his neck like an anchor. In his viewfinder moments ago, he'd seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about nature, compassion crossing species boundaries. It reminded him uncomfortably of moments in Iraq when supposed enemies had shown unexpected mercy. "In Fallujah," Marcus said slowly, "I photographed a Marine giving water to an insurgent who'd just tried to kill him. My editor wouldn't publish it, said it complicated the narrative. But it was the truest thing I ever captured." He looked at the trapped calf, at Grace's trusting eyes, at the waiting hyenas. Maybe the truest things always complicate the narrative. Tom felt Grace shift beside him, her anxiety growing as her calf's struggles weakened further. The hyenas were getting bolder, creeping closer despite Grace's presence. The scarred matriarch had moved to the front of the pack, her good eye fixed on the calf with an intensity that could have been hunger or something else entirely. "We're going to help," Tom declared, his voice carrying the authority of his former position. "Not because we're playing God, but because we're being human. And sometimes being human means answering when another mother calls for help." Emma was already moving, pulling on latex gloves and directing Marcus to get the toolkit from the Land Cruiser. "We'll need the handsaw first, then maybe the portable chainsaw if the branches are too thick. Tom, can you keep Grace calm? She needs to understand we're not hurting her baby." As they prepared for the rescue, Tom noticed something that made his chest tighten with a different kind of recognition. The calf had the same star-shaped marking on its shoulder as Grace, inherited like a family crest. But there was something else the way the calf held its head, slightly tilted, eyes unfocused despite its distress. "Emma," he called softly, "look at the calf's eyes, the way it doesn't track movement." Emma studied the calf more carefully, then her face changed. "Oh no, Tom, I think this calf might be partially blind, maybe deaf too. That would explain why it got trapped. It couldn't hear or see the danger properly." The revelation hung heavy in the air. In the wild, such disabilities were usually death sentences. Grace hadn't just been protecting her calf with unusual vigilance. She'd been compensating for its limitations, being its eyes and ears. And now, trapped and helpless, she'd turned to the only beings who might understand mercy beyond the brutal mathematics of survival. "All right," Marcus said, returning with the tools, his internal conflict resolved. "Let's save this baby." The approach to the trapped calf required a delicate choreography of trust and caution. Emma moved first, her medical kit in one hand, the other pressed against her pregnant belly for balance. The calf's eyes, unfocused and clouded, rolled wildly as she approached. its legs kicking with whatever strength remained. Grace made a low, rumbling sound deep in her chest. Not quite the infrared communication giraffes were known for, but something more primal, more universal, a mother telling her child that help was coming. "Easy, little one," Emma murmured, though she suspected the calf couldn't hear her. She was close enough now to properly assess the damage, and what she saw made her stomach clench. The fork of the branches had created a natural vise around the calf's neck, about 18 inches below its head. The struggling had only tightened the trap, and the swelling was severe. Dark blood had dried in rusty streams down its neck, and fresh red seeped from where the bark continued to cut into flesh with each labored breath. The hyenas retreated as the humans advanced, but not far. They maintained their loose circle at about 30 feet, the scarred matriarch sitting on her haunches like a patient dog. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something, watching with an intelligence that challenged everything he thought he knew about pack predators. Marcus had set up a perimeter of sorts, using the land cruiser as a barrier on one side while keeping his camera ready, through his lens. He captured the surreal scene, Emma reaching up to examine the trapped calf while Tom stood beside Grace, one hand on the mother's shoulder to keep her calm. The golden hour light painted everything in warm tones that would have been beautiful if not for the desperate circumstances. "The branch has cut off circulation," Emma announced, her clinical tone masking her growing concern. "There's significant swelling above and below the compression point. We need to be extremely careful when we free it. Sudden release could cause a rush of toxins back into the bloodstream. It's called reperfusion syndrome." Tom grabbed the handsaw from the toolkit, testing its teeth against his thumb. "Where do I cut?" "Here." Emma pointed to a spot about 2 feet from the calf's neck. "We need to remove this section first to give us room to work. Marcus, I need you to support the calf's weight when we start cutting. If it drops suddenly, it could break its neck." As Tom positioned the saw, the calf's panic intensified. Its hooves struck out blindly, one catching Emma's shoulder and spinning her backward. She stumbled, her hand instinctively going to her belly, and for a moment, everyone froze. "I'm okay," she gasped, though her face had gone pale. "But we need Grace to calm her baby, or someone's going to get seriously hurt." Grace seemed to understand. She moved closer to the trapped calf, positioning her massive body as a shield between her baby and the humans. Then she did something extraordinary. She began to hum. It wasn't quite a sound that human ears could properly detect, more of a vibration that they felt in their bones. The calf's thrashing slowed, its unfocused eyes seeking its mother's presence even if it couldn't see her clearly. Tom began to saw, the sound harsh in the evening air. Each stroke sent vibrations through the branch that made the calf whimper, but Grace's humming intensified, overriding her baby's distress with maternal comfort. Wood chips fell like snow, and Tom's arms burned with the effort, but he didn't stop. That's when Emma noticed something that made her pause. "Tom, wait, look at these marks on the other branch." She was pointing to a series of gouges in the wood, too deliberate to be from the calf's struggling. They were bite marks, dozens of them, some fresh enough that sap still oozed from the wounds. Emma traced them with her finger, her mind racing. "These are from different-sized jaws," she said slowly. "Large ones here, smaller ones here. Multiple animals have been chewing at this branch." Marcus zoomed in with his camera, documenting what seemed impossible. "Those are hyena bite patterns. They've been trying to chew through the wood." The revelation hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew. Tom looked at the circle of waiting hyenas with new eyes. They weren't waiting for the calf to die. They'd been trying to free it, as if responding to their recognition. The scarred matriarch stood and walked forward slowly, her head low in a non-threatening posture. Tom tensed, ready to protect Emma, but the hyena stopped about 10 feet away. She dropped something from her mouth, a piece of branch, still wet with saliva, clearly gnawed from the tree. Then she backed away, that milky eye somehow conveying an intelligence that transcended species. "My God," Marcus whispered, his camera clicking rapidly. They were trying to help. The hyenas were actually trying to help. Emma's scientific mind raced to process this. It makes sense in a way. Hyenas are incredibly intelligent, more so than most people realize. They have complex social structures, problem-solving abilities. But to show mercy to prey, to work together to free it, that's not just intelligence, that's empathy. Tom resumed sawing with renewed urgency, his strokes faster now. The branch was thick, hardened by years of desert sun, and his 68-year-old arms screamed in protest. Marcus took over when Tom's strength flagged. Then Tom again, trading off as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Finally, with a crack like a gunshot, the branch gave way. The calf's body sagged, its weight now entirely supported by the remaining branch still trapped around its neck. Emma immediately moved in, her hands exploring the swelling, checking for a pulse. "It's going into shock," she announced, her voice tight with urgency. "Body temperature dropping, pulse thready. We need to get it down and treat it immediately." The next phase required all three of them. Marcus supported the calf's hindquarters while Tom attacked the remaining branch with the saw. Emma monitored vital signs, calling out warnings when the calf's breathing became too shallow. Grace stood sentinel, her body blocking the wind, her presence the only thing keeping her baby from complete panic. As they worked, Tom became aware of the changing light. Sunset in the Texas Hill Country was usually spectacular, but today it felt like a countdown. Once darkness fell, their work would become exponentially more dangerous. The hyenas, patient as they'd been, were still wild predators, and there were other dangers in the darkness: leopards, snakes, even other giraffe bulls who might see Grace's vulnerability as an opportunity. The second branch finally gave way, and Marcus caught the calf as it fell, his military training evident in how smoothly he controlled the dead weight. They lowered it to the ground together, and Emma immediately went to work, her medical kit spread out on a sterile sheet. "Severe lacerations, possible tracheal damage," she muttered, more to herself than the others. "Dehydration, shock, probable infection setting in." She looked up at Tom. "I need the emergency kit from the Land Cruiser, the red bag with the IV supplies." As Tom jogged to the vehicle, he noticed the hyenas had moved closer again, forming a tighter circle. But their posture wasn't aggressive, if anything. They seemed to be creating a protective barrier, facing outward as if watching for other threats. The scarred matriarch kept glancing at Emma working on the calf, her head tilted with what could only be described as curiosity. Emma worked with an efficiency born of years of emergency veterinary medicine. Though her pregnant body made everything harder, she had to kneel differently, pause occasionally when the baby kicked, and Marcus noticed her wincing when she had to lean forward too far. "Should you be doing this?" Marcus asked quietly. "In your condition, someone has to," Emma replied, inserting an IV line into the calf's foreleg with practiced precision. "And right now, I'm the only one here who can." The IV fluids began to flow, antibiotics and pain medication entering the calf's system. Emma cleaned the wounds as best she could, applied antiseptic, and began suturing the worst lacerations. Grace watched every movement, occasionally lowering her head to nuzzle her baby, careful not to interfere with Emma's work. As Emma worked, Tom found himself drawn back to the Land Cruiser for a different reason. Something about this whole situation Grace knowing to come to them. The apparent recognition nagged at him. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a folder of photographs Margaret had kept there, images from the trail cameras she'd set up around the preserve. What he found made his hands shake. The photos were dated over the past 2 years, all from the camera near Margaret's grave, a simple stone marker on a hill overlooking the preserve. In image after image, Grace appeared, sometimes alone, sometimes with her calf. She would stand by the grave for hours, her head lowered as if in prayer. In one particularly clear shot, Grace's calf was nursing while Grace faced the headstone, and the date stamp made Tom's breath catch. It was Margaret's death anniversary. "She's been visiting her," Tom said aloud, his voice breaking. "Grace has been visiting Margaret's grave." Emma looked up from her work, saw the photographs in Tom's trembling hands. "Tom, Look at the dates, he continued, shuffling through the images. Every week, sometimes more, and she brings the calf. She's been bringing her baby to meet Margaret. Marcus took some of the photos, examining them with his professional eye. These aren't random visits. Look at the positioning, the consistency. This is deliberate behavior. She's maintaining a vigil. The calf's breathing had stabilized somewhat under Emma's care, though it remained unconscious. Grace seemed to sense the improvement, her posture relaxing slightly. She looked at Tom, those dark eyes holding a depth of understanding that transcended the supposed barrier between human and animal consciousness. "There's more," Tom said, pulling out a final photograph. It showed Grace at the grave, but she wasn't alone. The scarred matriarch Hyena was there too, sitting at a respectful distance. Margaret saved that hyena too, 3 years ago, caught in a poacher's snare, nearly dead. Margaret spent weeks nursing her back to health. Emma finished placing the last suture and sat back on her heels, exhausted. So that's why the hyenas were trying to help. They remembered Margaret's kindness too. The sun had nearly set now, painting the landscape in deep oranges and purples. Tom looked around at their strange assembly: 3 broken humans, a desperate mother giraffe, an unconscious calf, and a clan of hyenas maintaining a protective circle, all connected by the memory of a woman who'd believed that kindness could transcend species, that love was the only universal language. "We need to make camp," Marcus said practically. "The calf can't be moved tonight, and we can't leave it here unprotected." Tom nodded, but his eyes remained on Grace. Margaret always said animals remember kindness, that they pass it down through generations like we pass down stories. He touched the compass at his neck. "I never really believed her. Thought it was just her way of justifying all the time and money we spent on the preserve." "Maybe she was right," Emma said softly, checking the calf's IV line one more time. "Maybe memory isn't just neurons and synapses. Maybe it's something deeper, encoded in the heart." As if in response, Grace lowered her massive head and, with infinite gentleness, touched her nose to her unconscious calf. The gesture was so tender, so human in its expression of love and fear and hope, that even Marcus had to lower his camera and simply witness it. The scarred matriarch Hyena stood and gave a low call. Her clan rose as one, and Tom tensed, prepared for an attack. But instead, they spread out in a wider circle, taking defensive positions around the entire group. They were standing guard. "This is impossible," Marcus murmured. "Everything about this is impossible." "Margaret would have said it's not impossible," Tom replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have said it's just love, and love doesn't follow the rules we think it should." As darkness settled over the Texas hill country, they prepared for what would surely be the longest night of their lives. The calf's life hung in the balance. Emma's pregnancy added a layer of risk to everything, and they were surrounded by wild predators whose motivations challenged everything they thought they knew about nature. But somehow, in that circle of unlikely protectors, with the stars beginning to emerge overhead and Grace humming her subsonic lullaby to her injured baby, Tom felt Margaret's presence more strongly than he had since her death. Maybe she had never really left. Maybe she lived on in the kindness she'd planted, growing wild and strange and beautiful in ways none of them could have predicted. The night was coming, bringing its own dangers and mysteries, but they would face it together, human and animal, predator and prey, all bound by threads of memory and mercy that proved that sometimes, just sometimes, love really could conquer nature's darkest laws. The portable work lights Marcus had retrieved from the land cruiser cast harsh shadows across the scene, turning everything into a chiaroscuro of desperation and hope. The calf had been down for 30 minutes now, its breathing shallow but steady under Emma's constant monitoring. The IV drip continued its life-saving flow, but everyone knew this was just buying time. The real challenge, moving a 200-pound disabled calf to safety, still lay ahead. Emma had been checking the calf's reflexes when the first contraction hit. It started as a tightening across her lower back, familiar from the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been having for weeks. But this was different, deeper, more insistent, radiating around to her belly like a belt of fire. She gripped the medical kit, breathing through it, hoping no one noticed. "We need to get this calf somewhere safe," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The antibiotics will help, but infection is already setting in. Without proper treatment facilities." Another contraction, stronger this time. Emma's face drained of color, and she pressed both hands against her belly, unable to hide her distress. "Emma." Tom was beside her immediately, his weathered hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her sit back. "What's wrong? It's too early," she gasped. "I'm only 7 months. This can't be happening. Not here. Not now." Marcus dropped his camera, his combat medic training kicking in. "How far apart?" "Maybe 10 minutes, but they're strong. Really strong." Emma's eyes were wide with fear. "My doctor said I was at risk for premature labor. The stress, the physical exertion." Another contraction cut off her words, and she doubled over. Tom felt the world tilting, past and present colliding. Another woman in distress, another child in danger, another moment when he was powerless to stop catastrophe from unfolding. His hand found Margaret's compass, the metal warm from his body heat. "Not again," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep. "Please, God, not again." Grace seemed to sense the shift in urgency. She moved closer to Emma, lowering her massive body to create a windbreak, her presence surprisingly calming. The Hyenas, too, had noticed the change. The scarred matriarch stood, ears alert, her clan shifting their positions as if responding to an unspoken command. "We need to get Emma to a hospital," Marcus said, already calculating distances and logistics. "It's 40 miles to the nearest medical facility, in the dark, on these roads." "I can't leave," Emma protested, struggling to stand. "The calf needs constant monitoring, but if I go, it dies. If you stay and go into active labor." Marcus didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what could happen. A premature baby, born in the wilderness, miles from medical help. The statistics were brutal. Tom made a decision that surprised even himself. "Marcus, you take Emma to the hospital. I'll stay with the calf and Grace." "Tom, you're not a vet." "No. But I watched Margaret work for 20 years. I know the basics. And right now, Emma and her baby need professional help more than this calf does." He looked at Emma, saw her preparing to argue. "Margaret lost our son because I insisted on handling everything myself. I won't make that mistake again. Please, Emma, go." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but another contraction made the decision for her. She nodded, allowing Marcus to help her toward the Land Cruiser. As she passed Grace, she reached out and touched the giraffe's leg. "Take care of them, Tom," she said. "All of them." But as Marcus started the engine, the night erupted in chaos. From the darkness beyond the work lights came a sound that froze everyone's blood, the deep, coughing roar of a leopard, not distant, but close, very close. The hyenas reacted instantly, their loose circle tightening, facing outward with lips pulled back from impressive teeth. Grace's head shot up, her body trembling with the instinct to run, battling the need to protect her helpless calf. The leopard materialized at the edge of the light, a massive male, his rosette-covered coat rippling with muscle. His eyes reflected green in the artificial light, fixed on the unconscious calf, easy prey, vulnerable and bleeding. "Nobody move," Tom said quietly, though his hand went to the rifle mounted in the Land Cruiser's rack. "Marcus, turn off the engine." The leopard took a step forward, then another, his body low in hunting posture. The hyenas began their eerie whooping call, not the laugh-like sound most people associated with them, but something more primal, more threatening. The scarred matriarch moved to place herself directly between the leopard and the calf, her clan flanking her. What happened next defied every nature documentary Tom had ever seen. Grace, instead of fleeing or even attacking, walked deliberately toward the hyena line. She positioned herself alongside them, not behind or separate, but as part of their defensive formation. prey and predator, united against a common threat. The leopard paused, clearly confused by this unprecedented alliance. He was outnumbered now. 8 hyenas and a full-grown giraffe presented odds even an apex predator would think twice about. He paced the perimeter, testing for weakness. But the line held firm. Emma's contractions were 3 minutes apart now, but she couldn't look away from the scene unfolding. "Tom," she called from the vehicle. "The rifle." "No," Tom said firmly. "No killing. Margaret wouldn't want that." "Then what?" Marcus demanded, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Tom did something that would have seemed insane to anyone who hadn't spent the last hours witnessing impossible things. He began to sing, softly at first, then louder, his voice cracked with age but carrying across the night air. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. Grace's ears swiveled toward him. She knew this song. Margaret had sung it to her as a calf, sung it during every medical treatment, every feeding. The giraffe began to sway slightly, adding her subsonic humming to Tom's melody. "That saved a wretch like me," Tom continued, walking slowly toward the defensive line. "I once was lost, but now am found." The leopard stopped pacing. The hyena's aggressive calls softened. Even Emma's breathing seemed to ease between contractions. The song, simple and ancient, created a bubble of calm in the chaos. "Was blind, but now I see." On the word blind, Tom's voice broke. The calf was stirring, its unfocused eyes opening, and Tom could see the truth Emma had suspected. The cloudy corneas, the lack of pupil response to the bright lights. This baby was indeed blind, or nearly so. Its ears, too, didn't track toward sounds the way they should. The leopard made one more testing approach, but the united front of giraffe and hyenas, combined with the strange human sounds, seemed to finally convince him this meal wasn't worth the risk. With a final snarl of frustration, he melted back into the darkness. The danger passed, but Emma's crisis was escalating. Her contractions were almost continuous now, and a wetness on the seat told its own story. Her water had broken. "Go!" Tom shouted to Marcus. "Go now!" The Land Cruiser roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as Marcus executed a perfect combat turn and raced toward the preserve's exit. Tom watched the taillights disappear, then turned back to his impossible charges: a blind and deaf baby giraffe, its desperate mother, and a clan of hyenas that had appointed themselves guardians. The next 2 hours tested every reserve of strength Tom had left. Without Emma's expertise, he had to rely on instinct and half-remembered procedures from watching Margaret work. He checked the IV line, monitored the calf's breathing, cleaned wounds that kept seeping. Grace never left his side, occasionally reaching down to nuzzle her baby, her trust absolute and heartbreaking. Around midnight, the calf's condition worsened dramatically. Its breathing became labored, fluid rattling in its chest. Tom recognized the signs: pneumonia setting in, probably from aspiration during the trauma. Without proper suction equipment, without antibiotics stronger than what Emma had administered, he was watching the calf die. "No," he said aloud, his voice fierce. "Not on my watch. Not again." He remembered something Margaret had done once with a calf that couldn't breathe properly. It was risky, probably foolish, but he was out of options. Tom positioned himself behind the calf's head, lifting it to help drain fluid from the lungs. Then, using techniques he'd learned in ancient first aid training, he began percussive therapy on the calf's chest, firm, rhythmic taps to help break up the congestion. Grace watched, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. The hyenas maintained their protective circle, the scarred matriarch occasionally approaching to sniff at the calf, then retreating. It was as if they all understood that this human was their last hope. The calf convulsed suddenly, coughing up a disturbing amount of fluid. Tom kept working, his arms aching, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool night air. Another cough, more fluid, and then miraculously a clear, deep breath. "That's it," Tom encouraged, though he knew the calf couldn't hear him. Fight, little one. Your mama needs you to fight. The calf's eyes opened again, those clouded, sightless eyes that would make survival in the wild nearly impossible. But there was something in them, a spark of life, of determination inherited from its mother. It tried to lift its head, failed, tried again. Grace made a sound Tom had never heard from a giraffe before, something between a cry and a song. She lowered her head, touching her nose to the calf's, and in that moment Tom understood something profound. This wasn't just about survival. It was about love transcending limitation, about mothers who refused to give up on imperfect children, about the fierce grace of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The calf managed to lift its head on the third try, wobbling but determined. It couldn't see its mother, couldn't hear her voice, but it knew her smell, her touch, her presence. That was enough. It was trying to stand. Tom supported the calf's weight as it struggled to its feet, its legs shaking like leaves in a storm. Once, twice, it fell back down, but on the third attempt, with Tom's help and Grace's encouraging touch, the calf stood, blind, deaf, traumatized, but standing. The hyena matriarch approached slowly, that scarred face somehow gentle in the work lights. She sniffed the calf carefully, then did something that made Tom's eyes blur with tears. She licked the calf's face, just once. A gesture of acceptance that transcended every law of nature Tom thought he knew. Then she returned to her position in the protective circle. Tom's phone buzzed a text from Marcus. Emma in surgery. Emergency C-section. Prayers needed. Tom looked at Grace, at her broken baby standing on trembling legs, at the hyenas keeping watch, at the vast Texas sky overhead, where Margaret's spirit seemed to hover like a benevolent presence. "All right, Margaret," he whispered to the stars. "You believed in miracles. Help us out with a few more tonight." The calf took its first wobbling step, then another, guided by its mother's touch rather than sight or sound. It was heartbreaking and beautiful, this dance of disability and determination. Tom stayed close, ready to catch the baby if it fell, his aged body protesting every movement, but his spirit somehow renewed. Somewhere in a hospital 40 miles away, Emma was fighting for her baby's life. Here in the wilderness, surrounded by impossible alliances and improbable protectors, Tom was fighting for another baby's future. Both battles seemed hopeless. Both required a kind of faith that transcended logic. As the calf nursed successfully for the first time since the rescue, Grace looked at Tom with those ancient eyes, and he could have sworn he saw gratitude there. Not the anthropomorphized emotion humans project onto animals, but something real and profound, one parent acknowledging another's sacrifice. The night was far from over. Dawn still hours away, but they had achieved the impossible. The calf was alive, standing, nursing. Now they just had to keep it that way until help arrived, until Emma and her baby were safe, until this long night of miracles finally gave way to morning. Tom settled in beside Grace, his hand on her leg, Margaret's compass cool against his chest. Around them, the hyenas maintained their vigil. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. And somewhere between earth and heaven, between possible and impossible, love continued its quiet work of redemption. 3 hours before dawn, Tom's phone rang with the sound he'd been dreading. Marcus's voice was hollow, drained of his usual composure. "Tom, it's bad. Emma's lost a lot of blood. The baby, they got her out, but she's only 28 weeks. She's in the NICU, machines breathing for her. They're saying the next few hours are critical for both of them." Tom closed his eyes, his free hand finding Margaret's compass. Around him, the Texas night pressed close, held at bay only by the dying batteries of the work lights. The calf had been stable for the past hour, but Tom could see the telltale signs of infection spreading, the heat radiating from the wounds, the subtle smell of sepsis beginning. "Her husband?" Tom asked. "Red Cross is trying to reach him in Kuwait, but even if they do..." Marcus trailed off. They both knew David wouldn't make it in time if things went wrong. "Marcus, I need you to know something," Tom said, surprising himself with the confession that had been building all night. "I lost a son, Daniel, He was 12. The silence on the other end was complete, even the hospital background noise seeming to fade. He was autistic, Tom continued, the words coming easier in the darkness, with only Grace and the Hyenas as witnesses. High functioning, they called it, but he struggled. Margaret was better with him than I was. She had infinite patience. I wanted him to be normal, pushed him too hard. Grace shifted beside him, her massive body providing warmth against the cooling night air. The calf was sleeping fitfully, its breathing more labored than it had been an hour ago. The day it happened. Daniel had been having a hard time. Sensory overload from a school assembly. Margaret wanted to keep him home, but I insisted he needed to push through, learn to cope. We argued. Daniel heard us fighting about him. Tom's voice broke. He ran out of the house, straight into the road. The driver never had a chance to stop. Jesus. Tom. Margaret never said it was my fault. Never had to. She threw herself into saving every wounded creature she could find. Grace here was one of the first after Daniel died. It was like she was trying to prove that some things could be saved, that not everything broken had to stay broken. The calf stirred, a weak sound escaping its throat. Tom checked the IV, nearly empty. He had one more bag of fluids. But that was it. The antibiotics Emma had administered were wearing off, and he could see the infection taking hold, the calf's body too weakened from trauma to fight it off. Tom, Marcus said urgently, Emma's asking for you. The doctors have her sedated, but she keeps saying your name, something about the calf, about choosing. Tom understood immediately. Emma had left him with medical supplies for the calf, but those same supplies, the antibiotics, the sterile equipment might be needed for her premature baby. The hospital was small, rural, possibly running low on critical supplies for a micro-preemie. Tell her the calf is stable. Tom lied. Tell her to focus on her baby. After Marcus hung up, Tom sat in the darkness wrestling with an impossible choice. He had enough antibiotics for one more dose. He could give them to the calf now, possibly save its life, or he could race to the hospital with them, where they might make the difference for Emma's tiny daughter fighting for life in a plastic box. Margaret would have known what to do. She always did when it came to impossible choices. But Margaret was gone, and Tom was just a broken old man trying to hold too many lives in his inadequate hands. The calf's breathing grew more distressed as the eastern sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Tom could see the infection spreading, red streaks running from the wounds along the calf's neck. Without immediate intervention, it would be dead by sunrise. Grace seemed to sense the crisis. She lowered her massive head, nuzzling her baby with increasing urgency. The calf tried to respond but was too weak to stand. Its blind eyes rolled, unfocused and clouded with more than just disability now. I can't do this, Tom said aloud, his voice cracking. Margaret, I can't choose. How do I choose between them? The scarred matriarch Hyena approached, something in her mouth. She dropped it at Tom's feet, a root of some kind, still dirty from being dug up. Tom recognized it as wild garlic, something Margaret had shown him years ago. Natural antibiotic properties, she'd said, though not nearly as effective as modern medicine. But it gave him an idea. Not a solution, but a possibility. Tom's hands shook as he prepared the last dose of antibiotics, diluting it more than recommended, stretching it to make 2 doses instead of 1. It might not be enough for either patient, but it was better than choosing one life over another. He administered half to the calf, watching the medicine enter the IV line, then carefully stored the other half in a sterile container. Watch them, he told the hyenas, though he knew they couldn't understand. I'll be back. The 20-minute drive to the hospital was the longest of Tom's life. Every shadow could be the calf dying. Every phone silence could be news about Emma or her baby. He found Marcus in the hospital corridor, aged 10 years in one night. How are they? Emma's stabilized, but the baby? Marcus's voice trailed off. 28 weeks is so early. Her lungs aren't developed. They're doing everything they can, but... Tom handed him the vial with the remaining antibiotics. Get this to the NICU. Tell them it's from their patient's field supplies. It might help. Marcus didn't question, just ran. Tom collapsed into a waiting room chair, his body finally admitting to its 68 years. Through the window, dawn was breaking properly now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the darkness of the night. His phone buzzed with a text from the preserve's morning crew. Found your campsite. The Giraffe calf, Tom. You need to come back. Now. Tom's heart sank. He knew that tone. Had used it himself when delivering bad news. The calf was dying, maybe already dead. He'd failed again. Just like with Daniel. Just like with Margaret's last days when he couldn't save her from the cancer eating her alive. But when he arrived back at the site, what he saw defied expectation. The calf was standing, wobbling, but standing, surrounded by the hyena clan. The morning crew stood at a respectful distance, photographing the impossible scene. Grace stood proud beside her baby. And when she saw Tom's truck, she actually took a step toward him. We don't understand it, the morning ranger said. When we got here, the hyenas were licking the calf's wounds. All of them, taking turns. And the calf, it should be dead from that infection. But it's actually improving. Tom approached slowly, hardly daring to believe. The calf's neck still showed the angry wounds, but the red streaks of infection had faded. The hyena's saliva, he remembered Margaret telling him once, had antimicrobial properties, not enough to cure on its own, but combined with the half dose of antibiotics. His phone rang. Marcus. Tom, I don't know what was in that vial, but the baby just turned a corner. She's breathing better. The doctors are calling it remarkable, and Emma's awake, asking about Grace. Tom sank to his knees in the dust, Margaret's compass falling free from his shirt. Grace approached him, lowering her great head until they were eye to eye. In that moment, Tom understood something that had eluded him for 2 years. Margaret hadn't saved all those animals to prove something could be fixed. She'd saved them because the saving itself was the point. The trying was the point. The refusal to give up was the point. We're not done yet, he told Grace, told himself, told Margaret's memory. We're not giving up on any of them. The sun rose fully, bathing the Texas hill country in light that revealed the scars and beauty of the landscape in equal measure. The night's tragedy hadn't been erased, but it had been transformed. Sometimes that was the best anyone could hope for, not a perfect outcome, but the grace to keep trying despite imperfection. The calf took a tentative step toward its mother, guided by smell and touch rather than sight or sound. It was broken but not defeated, disabled but not helpless, alive against all odds, just like Emma's baby, just like Tom himself. The dark moment had passed, but its weight would remain, a reminder that life and death, hope and despair, were separated by margins thinner than morning mist. Tom had walked that line all night, and somehow, impossibly, everyone was still on the right side of it, for now. The morning light revealed details that darkness had hidden, and with them came recognition that stopped Tom cold. The scarred matriarch hyena, now resting near the calf she'd helped save, bore marks he should have noticed hours ago. The milky left eye. Yes, but also the pattern of scars across her shoulder, 4 parallel lines where barbed wire had nearly killed her 3 years ago. Survivor, Tom breathed. The name Margaret had given her flooding back with a tide of memory. The hyena's good eye fixed on him, and Tom could have sworn he saw acknowledgement there. He remembered the day Margaret had brought her in more dead than alive, caught in a poacher's snare that had cut to the bone. The other rangers had argued for euthanasia, but Margaret had spent 18 hours in surgery, then weeks of recovery, hand-feeding the hyena, singing to her the same hymn she'd sung to Grace. You know me, Tom said softly, approaching the matriarch. You remember Margaret. Marcus had returned from the hospital and was documenting everything with his camera when he suddenly lowered it. Tom, I need to tell you something about why I'm really here. Tom looked at him, seeing the weight the younger man had been carrying all night. My daughter Sophie, she's 17 now. She was diagnosed with autism when she was 4. High functioning, like your Daniel was. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he cleaned his camera lens unnecessarily. After Iraq, after seeing so much death, I came home to a child who couldn't look me in the eye, who screamed when I tried to hug her, who seemed trapped in a world I couldn't reach. The confession hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. I left, Marcus continued, his voice hollow. Told myself it was for work, for art, for healing. But really, I was a coward. I couldn't handle coming back broken from war to a child who was broken in a different way. My ex-wife, she never forgave me. Sophie doesn't even know I exist anymore. He gestured to his camera, to the thousands of photos he'd taken. Every picture I take is a letter to her I'll never send, trying to show her a world where different doesn't mean less than, where creatures survive despite their limitations. He looked at the blind, deaf calf now sleeping peacefully against its mother. This calf god, Tom, it's everything I want to tell Sophie but don't have the words for. Tom felt the weight of parallel grief. 2 fathers who'd failed in opposite ways, one by pushing too hard, one by letting go. Emma's voice interrupted from behind them. She'd returned from the hospital against medical advice, her face pale but determined, one hand pressed protectively against her belly where her daughter still grew. I discharged myself, she said before anyone could protest. The baby's stable for now. I needed to be here. I needed to tell you both something. She approached the calf, checking its wounds with professional efficiency despite her obvious exhaustion. The tests at the hospital confirmed what I already suspected. My baby has genetic markers for a condition, achondroplasia, dwarfism. My husband doesn't know. I haven't told him. The morning air seemed to still around her confession. 5 years of trying to get pregnant, and when it finally happens, the baby isn't perfect. David's family. They're all athletes, tall and strong. They won't understand. He might not understand. Tears ran down her face as she continued working on the calf. But seeing Grace with this calf, seeing how fiercely she protects it despite its disabilities, may be different isn't a tragedy. Maybe it's just different. Tom looked at the 3 of them. Marcus haunted by the daughter he abandoned. Emma terrified of the child she was about to have. Himself broken by the son he lost. All of them drawn to this moment, this place, these creatures that Margaret had loved. There's something else, Tom said, pulling out a worn notebook from his pocket, Margaret's field journal that she'd kept in the Land Cruiser. I've been going through Margaret's notes. Survivor here isn't the only animal she saved who's still around. He flipped through pages covered in Margaret's neat handwriting, dates and descriptions, sketches of wounds and recovery progress. Look at this. Over 15 years, she treated hundreds of animals, always marked them somehow tiny ear notches, specific scar patterns from her suturing technique. And according to her notes, many of them have offspring now. Emma looked up sharply. You're saying the animals here, many of them are connected to Margaret's work. More than that, Tom said, showing them a map Margaret had drawn. She tracked them. The zebra herd near the eastern border, the matriarch has a scar from a lion attack Margaret treated. The eagle pair that nests by the river, the male had a broken wing she set. Even some of the gazelles, she helped them through a mange outbreak that should have killed them. Marcus was photographing the journal pages, understanding dawning in his eyes. She created a network, not intentionally, but through acts of kindness. These animals, they remember. And they teach their young, Emma added, watching as one of the younger hyenas approached the calf, sniffing it carefully before settling down beside it. Behavioral inheritance. They pass down not just genetic information but learned responses. Trust, in this case, or at least the possibility of it. The scarred matriarch survivor stood and walked to Tom. She sat directly in front of him, that damaged face tilted up, and made a sound Tom had never heard from a hyena before. Not their laugh, not their whoop, but something almost like a question. Tom understood. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to a video Margaret had made him take of her, just weeks before the cancer made her too weak to visit the preserve. In it, she was sitting in this very spot, talking to the camera about the importance of coexistence, her voice strong despite her body's failing. He played it for Survivor. The hyena's reaction was immediate. Her ears went forward, her whole body tensing with recognition. She made that questioning sound again, looking around as if Margaret might appear from behind the acacias. "She's gone," Tom told her, his voice breaking. "But she remembered you. She remembered all of you." Grace had been watching this exchange, and now she moved closer, her calf wobbling beside her on unsteady legs. The giraffe lowered her head toward Survivor, and for a moment, predator and prey touched noses, a greeting that should have been impossible, made real by the ghost of a woman who'd believed in the possibility of gentleness. "This is why Grace came to us for help," Emma said with sudden clarity. Not just because she remembered Tom, but because she knew this place, these connections. She knew that here, the rules could be different, that mercy was possible. Marcus had tears running down his face as he photographed this moment of impossible grace. Margaret built something here that transcends normal wildlife behavior. She created a pocket of the world where kindness is remembered, where it gets passed down like an inheritance. Tom looked around at the scene, the blind and deaf calf alive against all odds. The hyena clan that had chosen to protect rather than prey. Grace's trust that humans could help. Emma and her imperfect baby still growing. Marcus with his gallery of letters to a daughter he'd failed. Margaret always said that love was the only thing that could break the world's rules, Tom said. I thought it was just something people say when they're dying, trying to make meaning out of chaos, but maybe she was right. Maybe she proved it. The sun was fully up now, warming the Texas hill country, revealing all the scars and beauty of this complicated landscape. In a few hours, they'd need to make decisions about the calf's future, about whether a blind and deaf giraffe could survive even in a protected preserve. Emma would have to return to the hospital, to face whatever challenges her daughter's condition would bring. Marcus would have to decide whether to reach out to Sophie, whether redemption was possible after so much time. But for now, in this moment of revelation, they stood in the center of Margaret's web of mercy, 3 broken people and a collection of wounded animals, all connected by threads of kindness that had somehow survived even death itself. The medical helicopter that arrived at noon seemed like an intrusion from another world, its rotors scattering the dust and sending the hyenas retreating to a respectful distance. The flight paramedics stopped short at the scene, a blind giraffe calf standing on wobbly legs, its mother towering protectively nearby, and a clan of hyenas arranged in what could only be described as a guard formation. "Is this some kind of Disney movie?" one of them asked, unable to process what he was seeing. Emma, who'd been monitoring the calf's steadily improving vitals, stood with difficulty. Her contractions had finally stopped, though she knew she'd be on bed rest for the remaining 2 months of her pregnancy. "It's better than that," she said. "It's real." The medical team had brought veterinary supplies at Marcus's request, stronger antibiotics, proper wound dressing, even specialized feeding equipment for disabled animals. As they worked to properly treat the calf's injuries, Tom noticed Grace's increasing agitation. She understood, somehow, that her baby was getting better. She also seemed to understand that their time here was ending. The calf, despite its blindness, moved with surprising confidence toward Emma. Using its sense of smell, it found her, pressing its soft nose against her pregnant belly. Emma gasped, feeling her baby respond with a strong kick, the first movement she'd felt since the crisis began. The 2 mothers-to-be stood there, connected by something beyond species or circumstance, and Emma found herself crying with relief and recognition. "She knows," Emma whispered. "Your baby knows mine." Grace approached Tom then, moving with the deliberate grace that had given her her name. She lowered her massive head in the same gesture she'd made when asking for help, but this time it felt different. This wasn't supplication, it was gratitude. And then, in a movement Margaret had taught her 15 years ago when she was just a calf herself. Grace crossed her front legs and bowed. It was the trick Margaret had used to delight schoolchildren during educational visits. But here, in this moment, it carried the weight of profound acknowledgement. Tom placed his weathered hand on Grace's neck, feeling the old scar beneath his fingers. "You're free now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of us are. Margaret's debt is paid. Grace, you don't owe us anything anymore." But Grace didn't move away. Instead, she stayed in that bow, and Tom understood. This wasn't about debt. It never had been. It was about love, the kind that transcends death and species and logic itself. Marcus had been photographing continuously, but now he framed the shot that would later win him another Pulitzer and, more importantly, bring him back to his daughter. In the foreground, Grace and her disabled calf. Beside them, Emma with her hand on her belly where her own imperfect child grew. Tom, his hand on Grace's neck, Margaret's compass visible at his throat. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, Survivor and her hyena clan predators who had chosen protection over predation. "This is going to change everything," Marcus said as he lowered his camera. "When people see this, when they understand what happened here, this challenges everything we think we know about animal behavior, about consciousness, about compassion." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear the calf was strong enough to travel. Grace began to lead it away, moving slowly to accommodate its blindness. But they didn't go far. They stopped at the hill overlooking the preserve, the one where Margaret's grave stood marked by a simple stone. The humans followed at a distance, watching as Grace stood by the grave for long minutes, her calf beside her. Then, with the setting sun painting everything golden, mother and child walked back into the wild areas of the preserve. Not truly wild anymore, they would be monitored, protected, helped when needed, but free. 6 months later, the dedication ceremony for the Margaret Mitchell Wildlife Research Center was small, intimate. Emma stood at the podium, her daughter Margaret Grace sleeping in a carrier against her chest. Born healthy despite her dwarfism, little Maggie had her mother's fierce spirit and her father's gentle eyes. David, home from Kuwait, stood beside them, having embraced his daughter's difference with a love that had surprised and humbled Emma. "This center," Emma said, looking out at the small crowd, "will study what Margaret Mitchell discovered through intuition and practice, that kindness creates networks of connection that transcend our understanding of animal behavior, that mercy, once given, ripples outward in ways we're only beginning to comprehend." Tom sat in the front row, holding Maggie during the reception, the honorary grandfather who'd become family in ways blood never could. He'd sold his empty house, moved into a cabin on the preserve, and spent his days documenting Margaret's network of kindness, the animals she'd saved and their descendants, the behavioral changes that persisted across generations. Marcus stood with his daughter Sophie, who'd come from California after seeing the famous photograph. She didn't make eye contact easily and sometimes flapped her hands when excited, but she'd spent the morning photographing the preserve's animals with an intensity Marcus recognized as his own. Their reconciliation hadn't been easy or complete, but it was real, built on the understanding that different didn't mean less than, that love could bridge even 17 years of absence. "Dad," Sophie said, pointing her camera toward the horizon. "Look." There, silhouetted against the morning sky, stood Grace and her calf. The young giraffe had grown strong despite its disabilities, learning to navigate by smell and touch, protected by its mother's fierce love and the strange alliance of predators who'd become guardians. Behind them, barely visible, trotted Survivor's clan, maintaining their inexplicable watch over the vulnerable pair. Tom pulled out Margaret's compass, now worn smooth by his own fingers. The needle pointed true north, toward the hill where Margaret rested, where Grace still visited weekly, where the impossible had become routine. "You did it, Margaret," he whispered. "You really did it. You proved that love is the only force in the universe that can rewrite the rules." The photograph Marcus had taken that morning, 3 generations of mothers, bound by circumstance and choice, would travel the world, sparking debates and wonder. Scientists would study the preserve for years, trying to quantify what Margaret had known by instinct, that kindness, consistently applied, could evolution itself toward mercy. But for now, in this moment, they simply stood together, a makeshift family forged in crisis, watching the sun rise over a preserve where the lame could walk, where predators could protect, where the broken could be whole, and where love, patient and kind, never failed. I used to think gratitude was just a word we said at Thanksgiving, something polite and hollow. But that night in the Texas dust, watching a wild giraffe bow to acknowledge a debt 15 years in the making, I learned gratitude is the memory of love that refuses to die. Margaret knew something I'm only now understanding. Family isn't built from blood alone. It's forged in those moments when we choose to answer another's cry for help, even when that cry comes from an entirely different species. Emma, Marcus, and I became family that night, bound not by genetics but by shared witness to the impossible. Grace and Survivor taught us that even predator and prey can stand together when love demands it. Every kindness Margaret showed created ripples I couldn't see until that night. The animals she saved didn't just survive, they passed down the memory of mercy to their young, creating a network of trust that defied nature's cruel mathematics. Her love lived on in ways she never imagined, proving that nothing good is ever truly lost. We're all broken somehow, blind like that calf, scarred like Survivor, grieving like me. But maybe that's exactly when grace finds us, when gratitude becomes our compass pointing toward home.